When Catherine Hartwell's mail-order groom arrived at her failing Nebraska ranch in 1884, she thought James Crawford was the answer to her prayers, a refined gentleman who could help her save everything she'd worked for. But as Pinkerton agents thundered onto her land with wanted posters bearing his face, she realized the man she'd married was living under a stolen name. Could a love built on deception survive the truth that threatened to destroy them both? The morning sun blazed across the Nebraska plains like fire on gold wheat, and Catherine Hartwell could hear trouble coming before she saw it. Hoofbeats drummed against the hard September earth, growing louder with each passing second. She dropped her hammer beside the broken fence post and shielded her eyes, watching a dark figure cut through the heat waves rising from the prairie grass. Her heart jumped in her chest. Today was the day. After 3 long years of struggling alone on this ranch, her mail-order groom was finally arriving. She wiped her sweaty palms on her worn cotton dress and tried to smooth down her tangled brown hair. What would he think of her? What would she think of him? The rider pulled his horse to a stop near her porch, dust swirling around them both like a small tornado. Catherine had expected someone rough around the edges, maybe missing a few teeth, perhaps smelling like whiskey and unwashed clothes. Instead, she found herself staring at a man who looked like he belonged in a fancy city restaurant rather than on a cattle ranch. His dark hair was neatly combed despite the long journey. His clothes were clean and well-fitted, though covered with trail dust. Most surprising of all were his hands. They looked soft, like they'd never held anything heavier than a book or a pen. "Mrs. Hartwell?" His voice carried the smooth sound of education, nothing like the rough cowboy drawl she'd grown used to hearing. "I'm James Crawford. I believe you've been expecting me." Catherine felt her mouth go dry. She'd written to the matrimonial agency in desperation, offering marriage to any man willing to help save her failing ranch. The bank president, Mr. Henderson, had made it clear that widows couldn't get loans. Only a husband's signature would keep the ranch from being sold at auction. "Yes, Mr. Crawford. Welcome to the Hartwell Ranch." She gestured toward the weathered buildings around them, the small house with its peeling paint, the barn with loose boards, the corrals that needed mending. "It's not much to look at right now, but it's home." James dismounted with the easy grace of someone comfortable on horseback, though everything else about him seemed out of place. He pulled a leather satchel from his saddle and looked around with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to notice every detail. "The land is beautiful," he said, and Catherine heard something genuine in his voice. "How many acres?" 1,200. "Good grazing land, but we've had problems." She didn't want to scare him away by mentioning the sick cattle, the dry well, or the fact that she owed more money than the ranch was worth. "Would you like some coffee? You must be tired from traveling." "That would be kind of you." As they walked toward the house, Catherine's mind raced with questions. Why would a man like this answer a matrimonial advertisement? What was he running from? Men didn't just leave comfortable lives to marry strange women on failing ranches unless something had gone very wrong. The kitchen door swung open before they reached it, and Marcus burst outside like a cannonball. Her 10-year-old son had been watching from the window, probably since dawn. His sandy hair stuck up in all directions, and his shirt was already dirty from his morning chores. "Are you really gonna marry my mama?" Marcus asked, staring up at James with the bold curiosity that only children possessed. "Marcus," Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mind your manners." But James smiled, the first truly warm expression she'd seen from him. "I hope to, if your mother will have me." He crouched down to Marcus's eye level. "What do you think? Should I stick around?" Marcus studied him seriously. "Can you fix things? We got lots of broken stuff around here." "I can learn," James replied. "Can you teach me about ranching?" The boy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "I know all about horses and cows and chickens. Papa taught me before he died." Catherine's chest tightened at the mention of her late husband. David had been gone 3 years now, killed when his horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and rolled on him. She'd been fighting to keep his dream alive ever since, but the fight was getting harder every day. "Come inside," she said, needing to change the subject. "I'll put the coffee on." The kitchen was small but clean, with sunlight streaming through gingham curtains. Catherine busied herself with the coffee pot, sneaking glances at James as he sat at her worn wooden table. His fingers drummed against the surface, long, elegant fingers that definitely belonged to a gentleman rather than a working man. "How long since your husband passed?" James asked gently. 3 years this November. Catherine kept her back to him, focusing on measuring coffee grounds. Heart attack took his father the year after, and his mother couldn't handle the grief. She moved back east to live with her sister, leaving you to run this place alone. Marcus helps, and we have Pedro Martinez. He's worked here since before I married David. Good man, knows cattle better than anyone. She turned to face him. But the bank won't extend our loan without a man's name on the deed. They say women can't be trusted with business decisions. James's jaw tightened. And so you advertised for a husband. A business arrangement, Catherine said quickly. I'm not looking for romance, Mr. Crawford. I just need someone willing to sign papers and help keep this ranch running. In return, you'd have a home, regular meals, and a share of whatever profits we can manage. What kind of problems are you facing? Catherine poured coffee into 2 chipped cups, grateful for something to do with her hands. Cattle sickness, dry spells, fence repairs, equipment that breaks faster than we can fix it. The usual ranch troubles, but all at once. James sipped his coffee and made a face. It was strong enough to wake the dead. Ranch coffee, David used to call it. I should be honest with you, Mrs. Hartwell. I know very little about ranching. Then why did you answer my advertisement? For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Fear, maybe, or sadness. Then it was gone, replaced by the same polite mask he'd worn since arriving. I needed a fresh start, he said simply. Sometimes a man has to leave his old life behind and build something new. Before Catherine could ask what kind of old life he was leaving behind, hoofbeats thundered into the yard again. This time it was Pedro, riding hard from the north pasture with his hat flying behind him. Catherine's stomach dropped. Pedro never rode that fast unless something was seriously wrong. Senora Catherine, Pedro called out as he slid from his horse. The cattle in the north field, many are sick. Very sick. Catherine felt the world tilt sideways. They couldn't afford to lose cattle, not now. Not when the bank payment was due in 6 weeks. James stood up from the table, his face serious. Show me. The ride to the north pasture took 20 minutes across rolling prairie land that should have been dotted with healthy cattle. Instead, Catherine counted at least a dozen animals lying on their sides, breathing hard and making low, painful sounds. Her heart sank with each sick cow she saw. Started this morning, Pedro explained, his weathered face creased with worry. They won't eat, won't drink. Just stand around looking miserable, then fall down. James dismounted and walked among the cattle with surprising confidence. He knelt beside a spotted cow that was lying in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree. The animal's eyes were glassy, and white foam bubbled around her mouth. Has the water source changed recently? James asked, examining the cow's gums and eyes with practiced movements. Catherine blinked in surprise. The mining company upstream started working a new section last month. Why? Heavy metals in the water supply, James said, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. Probably copper or lead poisoning from mining runoff. We need to move these cattle to clean water immediately and flush their systems. How do you know about cattle sickness? Catherine asked, staring at this man who claimed to know nothing about ranching. James paused, clearly caught off guard by his own expertise. I read about it once. Medical journals. Pedro nodded approvingly. See, makes sense. The creek has tasted different lately, more bitter. Can we save them? Catherine asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Each cow represented months of feed, care, and money she couldn't afford to lose. If we act fast, James replied, we'll need to drive them to the south pasture where the spring water is clean. Then we'll have to give them activated charcoal mixed with molasses to absorb the toxins. Activated charcoal? Catherine had never heard of such a thing. The general store in town should have it. If not, we can make our own by burning hardwood and crushing it fine. James was already moving toward his horse. Pedro, can you start moving the healthy cattle south? I'll ride to town for supplies. Wait! Catherine grabbed his arm. Who are you really? James looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her eyes. For a moment, she saw something vulnerable there, something that looked almost like panic. I'm the man you asked to marry, he said quietly. The man who wants to help save your ranch. Does anything else matter right now? The practical part of Catherine's mind screamed that yes, it mattered a great deal. But the cattle were suffering, and this mysterious stranger seemed to know how to help them. She could ask questions later. Take Marcus with you, she decided. He knows the shopkeepers, and they'll give you better prices if you're with family. James nodded and whistled for Marcus, who came running from where he'd been watching the sick cattle with wide, worried eyes. We're going to town, son, James called out. Think you can help me buy medicine for the cows? Really? Marcus's face lit up despite his concern for the animals. Can I pick out penny candy too? If your mother says it's all right. Catherine found herself smiling despite their troubles. One piece of candy, and you listen to everything Mr. Crawford tells you. As James and Marcus rode toward town, Catherine worked with Pedro to separate the healthy cattle from the sick ones. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat soaked through her dress as they pushed reluctant cows across the prairie. This man, Pedro said during a brief rest. He knows things, good things. Where did you find him? Through a matrimonial agency in Omaha. Catherine wiped her forehead with her sleeve. But you're right. He knows more than he's telling. Maybe that's not so bad, Pedro suggested. We all have secrets, see? What matters is whether a man will work hard and treat his family well. Catherine nodded, but questions continued to swirl in her mind. James Crawford spoke like an educated man, moved like someone comfortable with authority, and somehow knew exactly how to diagnose cattle poisoning. What kind of background did a person need to have all those skills? By the time James and Marcus returned from town, the sun was setting and the sick cattle had been moved to clean pasture. Marcus chattered excitedly about their trip as he helped unload supplies from the wagon. Mr. Crawford knew exactly what to ask for, Marcus announced. And he bought me peppermint candy and taught me how to count change in my head. James began mixing the activated charcoal with molasses and water, creating a thick, black paste. We'll need to get this down each sick animal's throat, he explained. It won't taste good, but it should absorb the toxins and help them recover. The work was hard and messy. Sick cattle didn't want to cooperate, and it took all 3 adults to hold each animal still while forcing the medicine down their throats. By the time they finished, everyone was covered in black paste and cow slobber. Will they be all right? Catherine asked, watching the cattle with worried eyes. We should know by morning, James replied. If the treatment works, they'll start eating and drinking normally within 24 hours. As they walked back toward the house in the gathering darkness, Catherine found herself studying James's profile. He'd worked as hard as any ranch hand, never complaining about the dirty, difficult job of doctoring sick animals. But his knowledge continued to puzzle her. Where did you really learn about cattle medicine? She asked. James was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke. I had a different life before coming here. A life that required me to know many things. What kind of life? The kind that's better left in the past. They reached the house, and Catherine lit the oil lamps while James washed his hands at the pump outside. Marcus had already fallen asleep on the kitchen sofa, exhausted from the day's excitement and work. I'll make dinner, Catherine offered, though she was bone-tired herself. Let me, James said, rolling up his sleeves. You've done enough today. Catherine watched in amazement as James moved around her kitchen with easy confidence. He found ingredients she'd forgotten she had, and somehow turned leftover beef and vegetables into a hearty stew that smelled better than anything she'd cooked in months. You're full of surprises, she said, accepting a bowl of the delicious stew. I hope they're good surprises. So far, Catherine tasted the stew and sighed with pleasure. This is wonderful. Where did you learn to cook? A man picks up skills when he needs them. Always the mysterious answers, Catherine thought. But as they ate in comfortable silence, she found herself hoping that whatever secrets James Crawford was hiding, they wouldn't be the kind that would drive him away. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel completely alone with her problems. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Catherine wondered what tomorrow would bring. Dawn arrived with the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, and Catherine bolted upright in bed, her heart racing. The sick animals, were they calling for food or crying in pain? She threw on her clothes and rushed outside, where she found James already at the fence, watching the herd with intense concentration. "They're eating," he said, and Catherine heard pure relief in his voice. "Look." She followed his gaze to see the spotted cow from yesterday standing knee-deep in prairie grass, methodically chewing with the steady rhythm of a healthy animal. Around her, the other cattle that had been sick were scattered across the pasture, grazing peacefully in the morning light. "The medicine worked?" Catherine breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "They're going to be fine." "Most of them," James corrected, pointing to 3 cows still lying under the cottonwood tree. "Those 3 are too far gone. We'll need to put them down humanely." Catherine's joy dimmed. 3 cows meant $300 lost. Money she didn't have to spare. But it was better than losing the entire herd. She nodded, understanding the harsh reality of ranch life. "I'll get the rifle," she said. "No." James's voice was firm. "I'll handle it." "You shouldn't have to." "This is my ranch," Catherine interrupted. "I've been making the hard decisions for 3 years. I can handle 3 more. Something shifted in James's expression, respect, maybe, or recognition of her strength. "Then we'll do it together." The morning's difficult task was made easier by James's gentle competence. He approached each suffering animal with quiet confidence, speaking in low, soothing tones before ending their pain quickly. Catherine watched him work and wondered again what kind of life had taught him such skills. "You've done this before," she observed as they walked back to the house. "Everyone has things they'd rather forget," James replied, but his tone suggested the conversation was closed. Pedro arrived just as they were finishing breakfast, his usual morning smile wider than Catherine had seen in months. "Senora, the cattle, they are well. My wife, she wants to cook a big dinner to celebrate." "That's wonderful, Pedro, but we can't celebrate yet," Catherine said, though she couldn't help smiling at his enthusiasm. "We still have the bank payment due in 5 weeks. "About that," James said, setting down his coffee cup. "I have some money saved. Not enough to pay off the loan, but enough to make the payment and buy us more time." Catherine stared at him. "How much money?" $500. The number hit Catherine like a physical blow. $500 was more than most ranch hands made in a year. What kind of work had James done to save that much? "I can't accept that," she said carefully. "Our arrangement was marriage in name only, not charity." "It's not charity if we're truly married," James pointed out. "Partners share their resources. But we barely know each other. What if? What if I turn out to be a scoundrel?" James's laugh held no humor. "What if I take your money and run off in the night? What if I'm not the man you think I am?" There was something in his tone that made Catherine's skin prickle with unease. "Are you?" Before James could answer, Marcus came running from the barn, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama, come quick. Something's wrong with Buttercup." Catherine's heart sank. Buttercup was their prize milk cow, the one animal they absolutely couldn't afford to lose. She provided milk for the family and cream they could sell in town. Without her, they'd have no dairy income at all. They found Buttercup in her stall, lying on her side with her legs stretched out stiffly. Her eyes were rolled back, showing mostly white, and her breathing came in short, panicked gasps. "She's having a seizure," James said, immediately taking charge. "Pedro, hold her head steady. Catherine, get me some cold water and clean rags." As Catherine ran for supplies, she heard James talking to Marcus in calm, reassuring tones. "Don't worry, son. Sometimes animals get sick suddenly, but it doesn't mean they can't get better." "Is she going to die like the other cows?" Marcus asked, his voice small and frightened. I don't think so. This looks different. More like she ate something that disagreed with her. Catherine returned with the water to find James examining Buttercup's mouth and gums. Definitely poisoning, but not from the creek. Something she ate recently. But she only eats hay and grain, Catherine protested. Check the grain bin, James instructed. Look for anything that doesn't belong. Weeds, strange seeds, anything unusual. Pedro hurried to the grain storage while James bathed Buttercup's head with cool water. The cow's seizure was subsiding, but she remained unconscious and unresponsive. A key, Pedro called from the grain bin. Look at this. Catherine peered into the wooden container and gasped. Mixed in with the normal grain were dozens of small, dark seeds that definitely didn't belong there. Jimsonweed seeds, James identified immediately. Highly toxic to cattle. Someone put these here deliberately. Deliberately? Catherine's blood ran cold. You mean someone tried to poison our animals? Who would do such a thing? Marcus asked, his young face confused and frightened. James's expression grew dark and dangerous. Someone who wants to drive you off this land. Someone who benefits if your ranch fails. Catherine's mind raced through the possibilities. The mining company that had already poisoned the creek? A neighbor who wanted to expand his holdings? The bank that would profit from foreclosing on the property? Can you save Buttercup? She asked, pushing aside her fear to focus on immediate concerns. Maybe. We need to flush the poison from her system, but it's going to take time and careful nursing. James looked up at her with serious eyes. Someone will need to stay with her around the clock for the next few days. I'll do it, Catherine said immediately. No, you have too much other work. I'll take the night shifts. James's tone brooked no argument. But first, we need to figure out who's trying to sabotage your ranch. How do we do that? By setting a trap. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. James worked with Buttercup, forcing medicine down her throat and monitoring her vital signs with the expertise of a trained veterinarian. Catherine found herself wondering yet again what kind of background had given him such specific knowledge. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table making plans, Catherine noticed how James's hands moved with practiced precision as he sketched a diagram of the ranch buildings. If someone is sneaking onto your property to sabotage things, they're probably coming from the east, he explained. The creek provides cover, and there's a natural path between those two hills. So we watch the eastern approach, Catherine said. Not we. Me. James's voice was firm. If this person is dangerous enough to poison cattle, they might be dangerous to people too. This is my ranch, Catherine reminded him. My fight. And you're my wife now, James replied. That makes it my fight too. The word wife hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither had fully considered. They talked about marriage as a business arrangement, but somewhere during the crisis with the cattle, it had started to feel like something more. James, Catherine said carefully, what kind of work did you do before? Really? He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. I was a teacher, he said finally, at a college back east. I taught veterinary medicine and animal husbandry. A teacher, Catherine repeated, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. That's why you know so much about animal sickness. Among other things, James's voice carried a weight of unspoken secrets. I had a good life, a respectable position, but sometimes circumstances force a man to make difficult choices. What kind of circumstances? Before James could answer, a sound from outside made them all freeze. Footsteps, trying to be quiet but clearly audible in the still night air. James was on his feet instantly, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to danger. Stay here, he whispered. Keep Marcus close. James, wait. But he was already slipping out the back door, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. Catherine clutched Marcus to her side and waited, her heart pounding so hard she was sure whoever was outside could hear it. A shout echoed across the yard, followed by the sound of running footsteps and a struggle. Catherine grabbed the rifle from beside the door and rushed outside, Marcus close behind her despite her whispered protests. In the moonlight, she could see two figures wrestling near the barn. One was clearly James, but the other was smaller, quicker, and seemed to be getting the better of the fight. "Stop right there," Catherine called out, raising the rifle. Both figures froze, and in the sudden silence, Catherine heard something that made her blood run cold. The second person was breathing hard, and the sound was distinctly feminine. "Let me go," a woman's voice said. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." James hauled the intruder to her feet, keeping a firm grip on her arm. "Then why were you sneaking around the Hartwell ranch at midnight?" The woman lifted her chin defiantly, and Catherine gasped in recognition. It was Sally Morrison, the banker's daughter, a pretty blonde girl who'd been making eyes at every eligible man in the county since she turned 18. "Sally?" Catherine lowered the rifle in confusion. "What are you doing here?" I wanted to see." Sally's defiance crumbled, and she began to cry. "I heard you got married, and I wanted to see what he looked like. You came here in the middle of the night just to spy on my husband? I didn't mean any harm. I just wanted to know if he was handsome, if he was nice, if he—" Sally's voice broke entirely. "Everyone in town is talking about how you found such a fine gentleman, and I was curious." Catherine felt a mixture of relief and irritation. "Sally Morrison, you scared us half to death. We thought someone was trying to sabotage the ranch." "Sabotage?" Sally's eyes widened. "Why would anyone do that?" James released her arm but kept watching her carefully. "Someone's been poisoning the cattle and contaminating the feed. We thought you might be involved." "I would never hurt animals," Sally protested. "I love animals." Looking at the young woman's tear-streaked face, Catherine believed her. Sally Morrison was silly and impulsive, but she wasn't malicious. She was just a lonely girl who'd made a foolish decision. "Go home, Sally," Catherine said gently. "And next time you're curious about something, try asking instead of sneaking around in the dark." As Sally hurried away into the night, Catherine turned to James. "Well, that was interesting, but it doesn't solve our real problem. Someone is still trying to destroy this ranch." "No," James said thoughtfully, "but it tells us something important. If Sally Morrison knows about the poisoning, then other people in town probably know too. And if they know, that means our saboteur is getting careless." "What do you mean?" "I mean, tomorrow we're going to town to ask some questions, and I have a feeling we're going to get some very interesting answers." The dusty main street of Millbrook buzzed with Saturday morning activity as Catherine and James rode their wagon toward Henderson's general store. Catherine had dressed in her best blue dress, the one she'd worn to church socials before David died, while James wore a clean white shirt that made his dark eyes look even more intense. "Remember," James murmured as they climbed down from the wagon, "we're newlyweds doing some shopping, nothing more." Catherine nodded, but her stomach churned with nervous energy. Someone in this town was trying to destroy her ranch, and she was about to walk among them with a smile on her face and pretend everything was normal. The bell above Henderson's door chimed as they entered, and conversations stopped mid-sentence. Catherine felt the weight of every stare as the townspeople took in the sight of her with her new husband. She'd forgotten how much small towns loved gossip. "Mrs. Crawford, isn't it now?" Mrs. Henderson emerged from behind the counter, her smile sharp with curiosity. "And this must be your new husband. My, what a distinguished-looking gentleman." "James Crawford," James said, extending his hand with polished manners. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." "Such lovely manners," Mrs. Henderson cooed. "And what brings you to our little town, Mr. Crawford?" "New beginnings," James replied smoothly. "I'm looking forward to learning about ranching and becoming part of the community." As they moved through the store, Catherine noticed how James charmed everyone he met. He complimented Mrs. Patterson on her apple preserves, discussed weather patterns with old Mr. Johansson, and even managed to make cranky Tom Mitchell smile with a joke about stubborn cattle. But Catherine also noticed something else. James asked seemingly innocent questions about everyone's business, who was buying what, who was selling, who was struggling financially. He was gathering information with the skill of someone who'd done it before. "Your husband certainly knows how to make friends," whispered Mary Chun, the doctor's wife, as they examined bolts of fabric. Where did you say he was from? Back east, Catherine replied vaguely, then changed the subject. How is your garden doing this year? Outside the store, Catherine confronted James about his behavior. You were questioning everyone in there like some kind of detective. I was making conversation, James protested. Don't you want to know what people are saying about your ranch troubles? What did you find out? Everyone knows about the poisoned cattle. And everyone has an opinion about who might be responsible. James lowered his voice. Tom Mitchell thinks it's the mining company trying to drive out nearby ranchers. Mrs. Patterson suspects your neighbor, Frank Olson, wants to expand his holdings. And Dr. Chun mentioned that the bank has been unusually interested in your property lately. The bank? Catherine's heart skipped. What kind of interest? The kind that suggests they already have plans for your land. Before Catherine could respond, a familiar voice called out behind them. Well, if it isn't the new Mrs. Crawford. Catherine turned to see Amanda Olson approaching with her usual superior smile. Amanda was Frank Olson's wife, a woman who'd never worked a day in her life but felt qualified to judge everyone else's choices. Amanda, Catherine said coolly, how nice to see you. I simply had to meet your new husband. Amanda gushed, her eyes roaming over James with obvious appreciation. Such a refined gentleman. However did you manage to catch him, dear? Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but James stepped smoothly into the conversation. I consider myself the fortunate one, Mrs. Olson. Catherine is a remarkable woman. Oh, I'm sure she is, Amanda said with false sweetness. Though I do hope you knew what you were getting into, Mr. Crawford. That ranch has been nothing but trouble for years. What kind of trouble? James asked, his tone casually interested. Cattle dying, equipment breaking, wells running dry. Some people just aren't cut out for ranch life. Amanda's smile turned predatory. Of course, my Frank would be happy to take the property off your hands. Save you the embarrassment of foreclosure. How generous, James replied, but Catherine heard steel beneath his polite words. I'm curious. How did your husband know about our recent cattle troubles? News travels fast in small towns. Amanda's smile faltered slightly. Frank keeps track of all the ranches in the area. Professional interest, you understand. I'm sure, James said smoothly. What line of work is your husband in? He's a successful rancher, of course. One of the most prosperous in the county. Amanda's voice carried a note of pride and defensiveness. And always looking to expand, I imagine, James continued. A man needs room to grow his operation. Naturally, Frank has vision, unlike some people who cling to failing ventures long past the point of good sense. Amanda's gaze flicked meaningfully toward Catherine. Catherine felt her temper flare. Our ranch isn't failing, Amanda. We've had some setbacks, but… Of course, dear, Amanda interrupted with mock sympathy. I'm sure you'll figure something out, though I do hope you won't wait too long. The bank can be so unforgiving when payments are missed. As Amanda walked away, Catherine turned to James with anger blazing in her eyes. That woman knows more than she's letting on. She certainly does, James agreed. And I think it's time we paid her husband a visit. The ride to the Olson Ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country in Nebraska. Rolling hills covered with golden grass stretched to the horizon, broken by stands of cottonwood trees and the occasional farmhouse. But Catherine couldn't enjoy the scenery. Her mind was too focused on the confrontation ahead. Frank Olson's ranch was impressive, with well-maintained buildings and sleek cattle grazing in large pastures. Everything about the place spoke of prosperity and success, which made Catherine even more suspicious about his interest in her struggling operation. They found Frank in his barn, a tall man with graying hair and shrewd eyes. He looked up from the harness he was mending and smiled, but Catherine noticed the smile didn't reach his eyes. Catherine, what a pleasant surprise. And you must be the new husband I've been hearing about. Frank wiped his hands on a rag and approached them. Frank Olson, welcome to the neighborhood. James Crawford, James replied, shaking the offered hand. You have a beautiful operation here. Thank you. Took years to build it up, but hard work pays off eventually. Frank's gaze shifted to Catherine. Speaking of hard work, I heard you've been having some troubles lately. Cattle sickness, wasn't it? We handled it, Catherine said shortly. Good. Though I have to say, I'm surprised you decided to take on a partner at this point. Frank's tone was casual, but his eyes were calculating. Most people would cut their losses and sell while they still could. The ranch isn't for sale, Catherine replied firmly. Oh, I'm not making an offer, Frank said quickly. Just observing that sometimes the smart thing is to know when to fold. No shame in admitting defeat. We're not defeated, James said quietly, but there was something dangerous in his voice. In fact, we're just getting started. Frank studied James with new interest. You sound like a man with resources. What line of work were you in before coming out here? Education, James replied. I taught at a college back east. A professor. Frank's eyebrows rose. My, Catherine, you certainly aimed high. Must be nice to have someone with book learning to help run things. Books don't teach you everything, Catherine said, but they help you recognize patterns, like how certain types of poisoning affect cattle. Frank's expression didn't change, but Catherine saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the harness. Poisoning is a serious accusation, Catherine. I hope you're not suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Catherine interrupted. I'm just saying that someone with education might notice things that others miss. Indeed, James added smoothly. For instance, I find it interesting how quickly news travels in this area. We discovered the poisoning yesterday, and already everyone in town knows about it. Small communities, Frank said with a shrug. People talk. They certainly do, James agreed. They also watch each other's property, notice who comes and goes, see things that might seem suspicious. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young man on horseback. He rode into the barn with urgent haste, then pulled up short when he saw Catherine and James. The young man's face went pale. I didn't know you had company. My son Bobby, Frank said tersely. Bobby, say hello to our neighbors. Bobby Olson was about 20, with his father's height but none of his composure. He looked nervous, guilty, and desperate to be anywhere else. Hello, he mumbled, not meeting their eyes. Bobby's been helping me with some projects lately, Frank said, his tone carrying a warning. Ranch work keeps a young man busy. What kind of projects? James asked with apparent innocence. Nothing that would interest you, Frank replied quickly. Just the usual maintenance and improvements. But Catherine noticed how Bobby's horse was lathered with sweat, as if it had been ridden hard. She also noticed mud on the young man's boots, the kind of mud that came from creek beds, not dry pastures. Well, we should be getting back, Catherine said, suddenly eager to leave. Thank you for the hospitality, Frank. Anytime, neighbors. And Catherine, remember what I said about knowing when to fold. Sometimes the smart play is to take your winnings and walk away. As they rode away from the Olson ranch, Catherine felt James's tension like a physical presence beside her. He knows something, she said. He knows everything, James replied grimly. And his son is involved up to his neck. What do we do now? James was quiet for a long moment, staring at the horizon with eyes that seemed to see dangers Catherine couldn't imagine. Now we get ready for war. The crash of breaking glass shattered the pre-dawn silence, jolting Catherine from restless sleep like a gunshot. She sat up in bed, heart hammering, as angry voices erupted from the yard below. Through her bedroom window, she could see the orange glow of flames dancing across the barn walls. Fire! She screamed, throwing on her robe and rushing downstairs. James! Marcus! The barn's on fire! But James was already gone, his side of the bed cold. Catherine burst through the front door to find him battling the blaze with bucket after bucket of water, his white nightshirt soaked and his face streaked with soot. The barn's eastern wall was engulfed in flames that reached hungrily toward the hayloft. Get Marcus out of the house, James shouted over the roar of the fire. Take him to Pedro's cabin. I'm not leaving you. Do it now. The authority in his voice brooked no argument. Catherine ran back inside, scooped up a sleepy Marcus, and carried him across the yard to Pedro's small cabin behind the main house. Pedro was already awake, pulling on his boots with urgent speed. Dios mío! Pedro gasped when he saw the flames. How did this start? Someone threw something through the window? Catherine panted, setting Marcus down. James saw them running away. Stay here with the boy, Pedro instructed, grabbing 2 empty buckets. Help will come. As Pedro ran toward the fire, Catherine watched through the cabin window with growing dread. The flames were spreading faster than James could fight them alone. If they lost the barn, they'd lose their hay supply, their equipment, and any chance of surviving the winter. Then she saw riders approaching through the smoke. 3 men on horseback, moving fast. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Neighbors coming to help? But as they drew closer, Catherine recognized Frank Olson's tall figure leading the group. What's he doing here? She whispered, pulling Marcus closer. Frank dismounted near the burning barn and walked over to James with casual confidence, as if barn fires were everyday social events. Even from a distance, Catherine could see James tense at the man's approach. Terrible shame, Frank called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Barn fires spread so quickly. Lucky thing I happened to be riding by. Convenient timing, James replied, never stopping his work with the water buckets. These old buildings are fire traps, Frank continued, making no move to help. Dry wood, stored hay. One spark and everything goes up in smoke. Catherine couldn't stand it anymore. She left Marcus with strict instructions to stay in the cabin and ran toward the burning barn, her bare feet slipping on the dewy grass. Help him, she demanded, confronting Frank directly. Stop talking and help put out the fire. Frank looked down at her with mock sympathy. Catherine, dear, I'm afraid it's too late. The fire's taken hold too strong. Best to let it burn and save what you can. You're wrong, Catherine shot back. We can still stop it if everyone helps. Some things can't be saved, Frank said meaningfully. Smart folks know when to cut their losses. James appeared at Catherine's side, his face grim with exhaustion and fury. Is that a threat, Olson? Just friendly advice between neighbors, Frank replied smoothly. Though I have to say, you folks seem to have terrible luck lately. Poisoned cattle, barn fires. Makes a man wonder what's next. Maybe what's next is finding out who's causing all these accidents, James said, his voice deadly quiet. Frank's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Careful, Crawford. Accusations like that could get a man in trouble. So could arson, James replied. The 2 men stared at each other in tense silence while the fire crackled behind them. Catherine felt like she was watching a chess game played with dangerous stakes, each man calculating his next move. The standoff was broken by the arrival of Sheriff Williams and several townspeople, including Dr. Chun and Tom Mitchell. They'd seen the glow of the fire from town and come to help. Within minutes, a bucket brigade was organized, and the flames began to retreat under the organized assault. How did this start? Sheriff Williams asked Catherine as they worked. Someone threw something through the barn window, Catherine replied, pointing to the broken glass scattered in the dirt. A burning bottle, I think. The sheriff examined the evidence with professional interest. Arson, then. Any idea who might want to burn down your barn? Before Catherine could answer, Frank Olson spoke up. Now, Sheriff, let's not jump to conclusions. Could have been lightning, faulty lantern, any number of things. Lightning? Sheriff Williams looked at the clear, starry sky. In weather like this? Stranger things have happened, Frank insisted. These old buildings are accidents waiting to happen. James stepped forward, his soot-stained face serious. Sheriff, we've had a series of suspicious incidents lately. Poisoned cattle, contaminated feed, and now this fire. Someone's trying to drive us off our land. That's a serious accusation, Sheriff Williams said. Do you have any proof? Not yet, James admitted. But I intend to find some. Frank laughed, but the sound held no humor. Proof has a way of disappearing, Crawford. Evidence gets lost, witnesses forget what they saw. Funny how that works. The threat was clear, and Catherine saw James's hands clench into fists. For a moment, she thought he might actually hit Frank Olson, but instead he turned away and resumed fighting the fire. By dawn, the flames were out, but half the barn was destroyed. The hay loft had collapsed, taking most of their winter feed with it. Equipment was damaged, and the repair costs would be enormous. Money they didn't have. As the townspeople prepared to leave, Tom Mitchell pulled Catherine aside. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about patterns and such. Frank Olson's been buying up struggling ranches for years, always after they've had mysterious problems. What kind of problems? Catherine asked. The Morrison place lost half their herd to a disease that only affected their cattle. The Jenkins Ranch had their well poisoned right before harvest season. Always something that drove them to sell cheap. Tom's weathered face was troubled. Never thought much about it before, but now you're wondering if those were accidents, Catherine finished. I'm wondering if Frank Olson is a lot more dangerous than any of us realized. That evening, as Catherine and James sat on their porch surveying the burned remains of their barn, the weight of their situation pressed down like a physical burden. They'd lost their hay, their equipment storage, and any illusion of safety. We can't keep fighting this alone, Catherine said quietly. We're not alone, James replied. You saw how many people came to help with the fire. This community cares about you. But they're afraid of Frank Olson. He has too much power, too much influence. Catherine rubbed her tired eyes. Maybe we should just sell and start over somewhere else. Is that what you want? Catherine looked out at the land her husband had died trying to build. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, the creek where Marcus learned to fish, the cottonwood tree where she and David had carved their initials as newlyweds. This ranch was more than property. It was home, legacy, dreams made real through years of backbreaking work. No, she said firmly. I want to fight, but I need to know who I'm fighting beside. James was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. My real name is Jonathan Blackwood, he said quietly. I was a professor at Harvard University until 18 months ago. I taught veterinary medicine and animal husbandry to the sons of wealthy families. Catherine felt her world tilt sideways. What happened 18 months ago? I made a terrible mistake. My sister Mary lived in Boston with her 3 children. Her husband died in a factory accident, and she had no money, no family except me. The children were starving, Catherine. Literally starving. Catherine waited, sensing there was more to the story. Harvard has a collection of rare books worth thousands of dollars. Medical texts, scientific journals, manuscripts that most people would never miss. James's voice grew heavy with shame. I took some of them, sold them to private collectors to get money for Mary and the children. You stole from Harvard, Catherine said, trying to process this revelation. Yes, and when they discovered what I'd done, I ran. Changed my name, learned to work with my hands instead of my mind. I thought I could disappear, become someone else entirely. Catherine stared at her husband. This stranger who'd saved her cattle, fought her fires, and shared her bed. Are there people looking for you? Probably. The Pinkerton detective agency doesn't give up easily. James finally met her eyes. I'm sorry I lied to you, but I swear on my life, Catherine, I never meant to bring danger to you and Marcus. The confession hung between them like a challenge. Catherine could feel the weight of choice pressing down on her. Accept this man with his dangerous past, or protect herself and Marcus by asking him to leave. Jonathan Blackwood, she said finally, testing the name on her tongue. Why should I trust a man who lies about his very identity? Because James Crawford loves you, he replied simply. Jonathan Blackwood might have been a thief and a coward, but James Crawford would die before letting anyone hurt his family. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the evening air. Catherine and James both tensed, hands moving instinctively toward the rifle that leaned beside the door. But these weren't neighbors or well-wishers. These were strangers in dark suits, riding with the purposeful confidence of men accustomed to authority. Even in the fading light, Catherine could see the gleam of badge and gun. "Jonathan Blackwood," the lead rider called out as they approached the house. "By order of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, you're under arrest." The wedding ring on Catherine's finger felt heavy as she watched 3 Pinkerton agents dismount in her yard, their polished badges catching the last rays of sunset. The lead agent, a lean man with steel-gray hair and cold eyes, approached the porch with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Professor Jonathan Blackwood," the agent announced, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "I'm Agent Morrison, Pinkerton Detective Agency. You're under arrest for theft of property valued at over $5,000. James, Jonathan, stood slowly from his chair, his face calm despite the danger. "Agent Morrison, you're a long way from Boston. Thieves run far when they're desperate," Morrison replied coldly. "Step away from the house, hands visible." Catherine's mind raced as she watched her husband move into the yard. $5,000, that was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. What had Jonathan stolen to be worth such an enormous sum? "There's been a mistake," Catherine called out, standing beside her husband despite the agent's threatening presence. "This man is my husband, James Crawford. We were married last week." Agent Morrison pulled out a worn photograph and compared it to James's face. "Ma'am, this man's real name is Jonathan Blackwood. He's wanted for the theft of rare medical manuscripts from Harvard University. Very valuable manuscripts that certain collectors pay handsomely to acquire." "Is this true?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer from James's expression. "The theft is true," James replied quietly. "But the circumstances." "Save your sob story for the judge," Morrison interrupted, producing a pair of iron handcuffs. "Turn around, Professor." "Wait!" Catherine stepped between the agent and her husband, her heart pounding with desperate courage. "You can't just take him. This is our ranch, our home. We have rights." "The only right your husband has is to a fair trial," Morrison said. "And that trial will happen in Boston, where his crimes were committed." As the agent reached for James's wrists, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Hold on there, Morrison." Everyone turned to see Sheriff Williams approaching on horseback, his badge gleaming in the fading light. Behind him rode Tom Mitchell and Dr. Chun, their faces grim with determination. "Sheriff Williams," Agent Morrison nodded curtly. "We're conducting official Pinkerton business here. Federal jurisdiction." "Maybe so," Sheriff Williams replied, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "But this is still my county, and I've got some questions about what's been happening on this ranch." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that involve arson, cattle poisoning, and deliberate sabotage," Sheriff Williams said firmly. "Seems to me that whoever's been trying to drive the Crawfords off their land might have tipped you off about Professor Blackwood's location." Catherine felt a surge of hope. The sheriff was connecting the dots. Someone had betrayed James's location to the Pinkertons, and that someone had to be involved in the attacks on their ranch. "I don't know what you're implying, Sheriff," Morrison said, but his voice carried a note of unease. "I'm implying that Professor Blackwood here might not be the only criminal in this situation," Sheriff Williams replied. "Tom, tell Agent Morrison what you told me on the way over." Tom Mitchell stepped forward, his weathered face serious. "Frank Olson's been buying up struggling ranches for years, always after they've had mysterious problems. Disease, fires, wells going bad, always something that forced people to sell cheap." "That's a serious accusation," Morrison said. "It gets more serious," Dr. Chin added. "I treated 3 families who sold to Olson after their cattle got sick. Same symptoms every time, symptoms that matched deliberate poisoning." Morrison looked confused by this turn of events. "What does any of this have to do with apprehending a fugitive?" "Everything," Sheriff Williams said, "because someone told you exactly where to find Professor Blackwood, and I'm betting that same someone has been trying to drive him and his wife off this land." As if summoned by the conversation, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Frank Olson and his son Bobby. They rode into the yard with casual confidence, as if they'd been invited to a social gathering. "Evening, Sheriff," Frank called out, dismounting near the group. "Heard there was some excitement over here. Thought we'd come see if our neighbors needed help." Catherine studied Frank's face and saw something that made her blood run cold. He wasn't surprised by the presence of the Pinkerton agents. He'd known they were coming. "Frank," Sheriff Williams said slowly, "funny thing, these agents seem to know exactly where to find Professor Blackwood, almost like someone sent them a letter with his location." Frank's smile never wavered. "Well, if a man's a wanted criminal, it's every citizen's duty to report him to the proper authorities." "So you did contact the Pinkertons?" Catherine accused, fury blazing in her voice. "I recognized him from a wanted poster," Frank replied smoothly. "Seen it in the post office weeks ago. Soon as I realized who he was, I knew I had to do my civic duty." "Your civic duty," James said quietly, "or your business interests?" "I don't know what you mean," Frank said, but his son Bobby shifted nervously beside him. "I think you do." Sheriff Williams stepped closer to Frank. "I think you've been trying to drive the Crawfords off their land so you can buy it cheap. And when Professor Blackwood showed up and started solving their problems, you realized you needed a different approach." "That's ridiculous," Frank blustered. "I'm a respected member of this community." "You're a saboteur and probably a murderer," James interrupted, his voice cold with controlled fury. "How many ranchers have you driven off their land, Olson? How many families have you destroyed?" Frank's mask finally slipped, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "You can't prove anything, Professor, and in about 5 minutes, you'll be in handcuffs on your way back to Boston." "Maybe," James conceded, "but my wife will still be here, and she knows everything now." Catherine felt the weight of truth settling around her like armor. "I know you poisoned our cattle. I know you contaminated our feed. I know you burned our barn and tried to terrorize us into selling." "Prove it," Frank challenged. "I don't have to," Catherine replied, "because your son is going to tell us everything." All eyes turned to Bobby Olson, who had gone pale as moonlight. The young man looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "Bobby's a good boy," Frank said quickly. "He follows his father's orders." "Bobby's scared," Sheriff Williams observed. "And scared boys sometimes make bad decisions they regret later." "Don't say anything, son," Frank warned. But Bobby was staring at the burned remains of the barn, his face twisted with guilt and shame. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," he whispered. "Bobby, shut your mouth," Frank commanded. "I can't, Pa." Bobby's voice cracked with emotion. "What if the fire had spread to the house? What if we'd killed that little boy?" "You threw the burning bottle," Catherine said, pieces falling into place. Bobby nodded miserably. "Pa said it would just scare you, make you want to sell. But when I saw the flames get so big, so fast." He looked up at his father with pleading eyes. "I don't want to do this anymore, Pa. These are good people." Frank's face darkened with rage. "You weak little fool. After everything I've done for you." "You mean after everything you've made him do for you," James corrected. "How long have you been using your son to sabotage neighboring ranches?" "Since I was 16, Bobby said quietly. "Started with just moving fence posts, opening gates. But it got worse every year." Agent Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "This is all very fascinating," he said finally. "But I still have a job to do. Professor Blackwood is coming with me." "No," Catherine said firmly. "He's not." "Ma'am, you can't interfere with." "I can and I will," Catherine interrupted. "Sheriff Williams, I want to press charges against Frank and Bobby Olson for arson, cattle poisoning, and criminal sabotage." "You can't prove anything," Frank snarled. "Bobby just confessed to everything," Sheriff Williams pointed out. "Son, are you willing to testify about your father's activities?" Bobby looked at his father, then at the burned barn, then at Marcus, who had crept out of Pedro's cabin to watch the proceedings. "Yes, sir. I'll tell you everything." Frank Olson's face went through a series of expressions. fury, disbelief, and finally cold calculation. "This isn't over," he said to Catherine. "You think you've won, but you don't know what kind of man you married. When the truth comes out about his past." "I already know about his past," Catherine said calmly. "And I don't care." She turned to Agent Morrison with determination blazing in her eyes. "My husband made a mistake, but he spent every day since then trying to make up for it. He saved my cattle, protected my family, and helped me fight for this ranch. That's the man I married, and that's the man I'm going to protect." Morrison looked around at the assembled townspeople, all of whom were nodding in agreement with Catherine's words. "This is highly irregular. So is using a federal fugitive hunt to help a local land grabber destroy innocent families," Sheriff Williams pointed out. "Seems to me like there's enough criminal activity here to keep us all busy for a while." As Agent Morrison considered his options, Catherine moved to James's side and took his hand. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "we face it together." James squeezed her fingers, his eyes bright with emotion. "Even if I have to go back to Boston? Even then. But I don't think you're going anywhere." Catherine looked at the sheriff, the townspeople, and even Agent Morrison with steady confidence. "Sometimes the law needs to serve justice, not just rules. And justice means letting good people build good lives, even if they've made mistakes in the past." In the growing darkness, with the smell of smoke still hanging in the air and the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance, Catherine Hartwell Crawford stood beside her husband and faced an uncertain future with absolute certainty about one thing. Love was worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The telegram that arrived at dawn 3 days later changed everything, its yellow paper crackling in Catherine's trembling hands as she read words that made her knees go weak. "Harvard University withdraws all charges. Stop. Professor Blackwood cleared. Stop. Return to Boston requested. Stop. Full reinstatement offered. Stop." "James!" she called, running toward the barn where he was feeding the horses. "James, you have to see this." Agent Morrison had reluctantly agreed to wait for word from Boston after Sheriff Williams threatened to arrest him for interfering with a local investigation. Now, 3 days later, the waiting was over, but not in the way anyone had expected. James read the telegram twice, his face cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that looked almost like fear. "They want me back," he said quietly. "Full professor, restored reputation, everything I lost." "That's wonderful," Catherine exclaimed, then stopped as the full meaning hit her. "They want you back in Boston. The children I helped, my sister's family, they came forward," James explained, still staring at the telegram. "Testified about why I took the books, how I used the money. Harvard's board of directors voted to drop all charges and offer reinstatement." Catherine felt joy and terror war in her chest. "So you're free. Completely free." "Free to choose," James corrected, his eyes meeting hers. "Free to go back to my old life, or stay here and build a new one." Before Catherine could respond, Marcus burst through the barn doors with the explosive energy of a 10-year-old carrying important news. "Mama, Papa James, Sheriff Williams is coming, and he's got Bobby Olson with him." Through the barn door, they could see the sheriff's wagon approaching with Bobby sitting hunched in the back, his hands unshackled but his face bearing the weight of confession. Behind them rode Agent Morrison and 2 other men Catherine didn't recognize. "Looks like we're about to get some answers," James said grimly. They gathered in the yard as Sheriff Williams helped Bobby down from the wagon. The young man looked like he'd aged years in the past 3 days, his eyes red from lack of sleep and his hands shaking with nervous energy. "Bobby here has something he wants to tell you folks," Sheriff Williams announced. "Been talking for 2 days straight about everything his father made him do." Bobby lifted his head to look at Catherine, his voice barely above a whisper. "I poisoned your cattle, ma'am. Put jimsonweed seeds in your grain, contaminated your creek water with mining runoff. Pa said it was business, that we were just helping you make a smart decision to sell." "What else?" Sheriff Williams prompted gently. "Burned your barn, cut your fence wire, spooked your horses during that thunderstorm last month." Bobby's voice grew stronger with each confession, as if admitting the truth was lifting a weight from his shoulders. "Pa's been doing this for years, driving families off their land so he could buy cheap and sell high. One of the men Catherine didn't recognize stepped forward. "I'm District Attorney Harrison from the state capitol. Based on Mr. Olson's testimony, we're prepared to file charges against his father for conspiracy, arson, cattle rustling, and fraud." "Where is Frank now?" Catherine asked. "Fled in the night," Sheriff Williams replied grimly. "Cleaned out his bank accounts and disappeared. Left his wife and ranch behind." Catherine felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Frank Olson was gone, which meant the immediate threat was over. But he'd escaped justice, and Amanda Olson, whatever her faults, didn't deserve to be abandoned. "What about Bobby?" James asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. District Attorney Harrison consulted his notes. Given his cooperation and the fact that he was clearly acting under his father's coercion, we're recommending community service and restitution rather than prison time. Bobby looked up with desperate hope. "I'll work for you, Mrs. Crawford. Free of charge, as long as it takes to pay back what I owe. I know cattle, I know farming, and I swear I'll never lie to you again." Catherine studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with determination. "What about your mother? What about the Olson ranch?" "Ma's gonna sell to the bank and move back east to live with her sister," Bobby replied. "She says she never wants to see another cow as long as she lives." Agent Morrison cleared his throat impatiently. "This is all very touching, but I need to know Professor Blackwood's decision. Am I taking him back to Boston, or is he staying here?" Catherine's heart stopped as she waited for James's answer. Everything depended on the next few words: their marriage, their future, their family. James looked at the telegram in his hands, then at the burned barn they'd been rebuilding together, then at Marcus, who was watching with worried eyes. Finally, his gaze settled on Catherine. "Agent Morrison," he said formally, "please send my regrets to Harvard University. Professor Jonathan Blackwood is honored by their offer, but he's no longer available." "You're turning down full reinstatement?" Morrison asked incredulously. "I'm choosing my family," James replied simply. "James Crawford has work to finish here." Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes as relief flooded through her like warm sunshine. But before she could speak, Marcus stepped forward with the serious expression he wore when wrestling with grown-up concepts. "Papa James," he said carefully, "are you sure? Mama always says we should think real hard before making big decisions." James crouched down to Marcus's eye level, his voice gentle but firm. "I've thought about it, son, and I'd rather be James Crawford living on a struggling ranch with the people I love than Professor Blackwood living in a big house all alone. Even if we're poor? Even if we're poor. Besides," James added with a grin, "who says we're going to stay poor? We've got cattle to raise, land to work, and a ranch to rebuild. Seems to me like we've got everything we need for success." District Attorney Harrison interrupted their moment with a practical question. "Speaking of rebuilding, there's the matter of restitution. The damages to your property are substantial." "How substantial?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Barn repairs, lost cattle, contaminated feed, damaged equipment, close to $800. Catherine's heart sank. $800 might as well have been $8,000 for all their ability to pay it. "I'll work it off," Bobby said immediately. "However long it takes." "That could be years," Catherine pointed out. "Then it'll be years," Bobby replied with quiet determination. "I helped cause this mess, and I'm gonna help fix it." James stood up, brushing dust from his knees. "Actually, I might have a better idea." Everyone turned to look at him with curiosity. "The Olson Ranch is going up for sale, right? Good land, well-maintained buildings, established cattle operation." "Yes," District Attorney Harrison confirmed. "The bank's handling the sale to settle Frank Olson's debts." "What if we bought it?" James asked, looking at Catherine with excitement building in his voice. "Combined the two ranches into one operation. We'd have enough land to really prosper, and Bobby could work as our foreman instead of just a hired hand." Catherine stared at him in disbelief. "With what money? We can barely make our own bank payments." James pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Not the telegram, but something else. While you were reading the telegram, Pedro brought this from town. Letter from my publisher in New York. Your publisher? I've been writing, James explained, his cheeks reddening slightly. A book about practical veterinary medicine for ranchers and farmers. Simple language, common problems, real solutions. They want to publish it. Catherine took the letter with shaking hands and read the publisher's offer. The advance payment was enough to buy the Olson Ranch outright and still have money left over for improvements. You wrote a book? She asked in amazement. Evenings, when you thought I was just reading, James admitted. I wanted to contribute something more than just physical labor. Wanted to prove I could be useful in ways that mattered. Marcus tugged on James's sleeve. Does this mean we're going to be rich? It means we're going to be smart, James corrected. Rich is what you have in your bank account. Smart is what you have in your head and your heart. Agent Morrison shook his head in bewilderment. So let me understand this. You're turning down a prestigious position at Harvard University to buy a ranch in Nebraska and write books about cow medicine. I'm choosing to be where I'm needed most, James replied. Harvard has plenty of professors, but Catherine needs a partner. Marcus needs a father, and this community needs someone willing to stand up to bullies like Frank Olson. Sheriff Williams grinned and extended his hand to James. Welcome to Nebraska, Professor Crawford. Something tells me you're going to fit in just fine. As the officials prepared to leave, Catherine found herself alone with James for the first time since the telegram's arrival. The weight of his decision, choosing her over prestige, their life together over his former success, left her feeling both grateful and worried. Are you sure? She asked quietly. Really sure? Because once Agent Morrison leaves, there's no going back. James took her hands in his eyes serious but calm. Catherine, 18 months ago, I thought success meant respect from colleagues and a big office with leather chairs. But working this ranch with you, watching Marcus learn to be a man, being part of something real and important, that's what success actually looks like. Even when the work is hard and the money's tight? Especially then, James replied. Easy things don't teach you who you really are. Hard things do. Catherine smiled, feeling the last of her fears dissolve. In that case, James Crawford, I think we're about to learn a lot about ourselves. As Agent Morrison's wagon disappeared down the dusty road toward town, Catherine stood beside her husband and watched the sun set over their land. Land that would soon be twice as large, twice as prosperous, and completely their own. So, she said, leaning against James's shoulder, what do we do first? Buy the Olson Ranch or rebuild our barn? First, James said, wrapping his arm around her waist, we finish what we started. The barn, the cattle, the life we're building together. The rest can wait. And Bobby gets a second chance, just like I did. Sometimes that's all a person needs to become who they're supposed to be. In the distance, Marcus was playing with Pedro's children, their laughter carrying across the evening air like a promise of better days ahead. Catherine closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of home. Cattle lowing, horses nickering, the wind through the grass, and realized that everything she'd ever wanted was right here in this moment. 6 weeks later, the sound of hammering echoed across the Crawford Ranch as Catherine climbed the ladder to help James secure the final beam of their new barn roof. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, but sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked alongside her husband to complete the structure that would shelter their expanded herd through the cold months ahead. Hand me that rope, James called down from the peak, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the chill. We need to tie off this corner before the wind picks up. Catherine passed him the rope and marveled at how natural this felt. Working together, building something with their own hands, creating security from nothing but determination and hard work. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a struggling widow on the verge of losing everything. Now she was half of a partnership that owned the largest ranch operation in the county. Mama, Papa James. Marcus's voice carried from the yard below. Riders coming. Catherine shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun and saw a small group approaching from the direction of town. As they drew closer, she recognized Pastor Lindgren leading the group, followed by Tom Mitchell, Dr. Chun, and several other neighbors. Looks like the welcoming committee, James observed with a grin, securing the last knot with practiced efficiency. They climbed down from the barn roof to greet their visitors, and Catherine noticed that each person carried something. Covered dishes, wrapped packages, bottles of what was probably Pedro's famous apple cider. "We come bearing gifts," Pastor Lindgren announced with a warm smile. "The whole community wanted to celebrate your success and welcome you properly to the neighborhood." "You didn't need to do this," Catherine protested, though she was touched by their thoughtfulness. "Actually, we did," Tom Mitchell said gruffly. "Frank Olson terrorized half the families in this county for years. You folks standing up to him gave the rest of us courage to speak out." Dr. Chun nodded in agreement. 3 more families have come forward with stories about mysterious cattle sickness and equipment failures right before Olson made offers on their land. Sheriff Williams thinks he can build a case even without Frank here to prosecute. "What about Amanda?" Catherine asked, concerned about Frank's abandoned wife despite their past differences. "Moved back east last week," Pastor Lindgren replied. "Said she never knew about Frank's illegal activities, and I believe her. The sale of the ranch gave her enough money to start over somewhere far from here." As they set up an impromptu picnic in the yard, Bobby Olson approached carrying a wooden crate that clinked with the sound of glass bottles. In the 6 weeks since his father's disappearance, the young man had transformed from a guilty, frightened boy into a reliable ranch hand with calloused palms and sun-weathered skin. "Fresh milk from the new cows," Bobby announced, setting down his burden with pride. "And Mrs. Martinez sent some of her cheese to go with it." "How are the new cattle settling in?" James asked, accepting a bottle of the rich, creamy milk. "Like they were born here," Bobby replied enthusiastically. "The grass on the north section is some of the best grazing I've ever seen. We should be able to support twice as many head by next spring." Catherine smiled at Bobby's transformation. Working honest labor for honest pay had given him a confidence and dignity that his father's schemes never could. He'd become like an older brother to Marcus, teaching him to rope and ride while learning from James about animal husbandry and land management. "Speaking of next spring," Pastor Lindgren said, pulling out an official-looking envelope, "this came for you at the post office. Return address says Harvard University." Catherine's heart skipped as James accepted the letter with curious confusion. "I thought we settled everything with Harvard." "Maybe they changed their minds about accepting your resignation," she suggested, though the thought made her stomach clench with worry. James opened the envelope and read silently, his expression cycling through surprise, amusement, and finally delight. "It's not what you think," he said, looking up at Catherine with sparkling eyes. "They want to publish my veterinary guide as part of their agricultural education series." "Publish your book?" Catherine grabbed the letter and read the offer herself. "James, they're offering to distribute it to every farming college in the country." "What's that mean?" Marcus asked, tugging on James's sleeve. "It means Papa James is going to be famous," Catherine explained, excitement bubbling in her voice. "Farmers and ranchers all over America will read his book and learn how to take better care of their animals." Tom Mitchell chuckled and slapped James on the back. "From fugitive to famous author in 6 weeks. That's got to be some kind of record." "I'm not famous yet," James protested, but Catherine could see the pride in his expression. "It's just a practical guide for working folks." "Practical guides are exactly what working folks need," Dr. Chun observed. "Too many books are written by people who've never actually done the work they're writing about." As the impromptu celebration continued into the evening, Catherine found herself watching James interact with their neighbors and marveled at how completely he'd adapted to this life. The refined professor who'd arrived 6 weeks ago had been replaced by a man comfortable with dirt under his fingernails and hay in his hair. "Penny for your thoughts," James said, appearing beside her as she stood apart from the group. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Catherine replied. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's all real." "What part feels unreal?" Catherine gestured toward the new barn, the expanded herd visible in the distance. The neighbors gathered in their yard sharing food and friendship. "All of it. 6 weeks ago I was about to lose everything. Now we have more than I ever dreamed possible. You were never going to lose everything, James said gently. You're too strong, too stubborn, too determined to let that happen. I felt pretty helpless when the cattle were dying and the barn was burning. But you didn't give up. You kept fighting, kept looking for solutions. That's what real strength looks like. Catherine turned to study her husband's profile in the lamplight. What about you? Any regrets about giving up your professor position? James was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. You know what I miss most about Harvard? The respect, the security, the library, James said with a laugh. All those books, all that knowledge just sitting there waiting to be discovered. But then I realize we're living knowledge now instead of just reading about it. We're creating something real with our hands and our hearts. And writing about it for other people to learn from. Exactly. Turns out teaching doesn't require a classroom if you have something worth sharing. Their conversation was interrupted by Pedro's arrival with his guitar and Maria's beautiful singing voice. Soon the entire group was gathered around a small fire, sharing stories and songs that carried across the prairie like prayers of gratitude. Marcus had fallen asleep against James's shoulder, his small face peaceful in the firelight. Catherine watched her son, their son now, and felt a deep sense of completion. For 3 years after David's death, she'd carried the burden of single parenthood like a weight that never lessened. Now that weight was shared, and Marcus had a father figure who would teach him not just how to work, but how to think and dream and become a good man. I have an announcement, James said suddenly, his voice carrying over the conversations around the fire. Everyone turned to listen, and Catherine felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with apprehension. Catherine and I have been talking about expanding our operation beyond just cattle ranching, James continued. We want to turn this place into a training center for young farmers and ranchers. A place where people can come to learn practical skills and modern methods. Catherine blinked in surprise. This was news to her, but as James explained the idea, she felt excitement building in her chest. Sort of like a college, but for real farming instead of just theory, James elaborated. We'd teach animal husbandry, land management, crop rotation, business planning, everything a person needs to succeed in agriculture. That's a wonderful idea, Pastor Lindgren said enthusiastically. There are so many young people leaving family farms because they don't know how to make them profitable. And so many city folks who want to try farming but don't know where to start, Dr. Chen added. Tom Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. Place like that could change the whole character of farming in this region. Make it more scientific, more efficient. More hopeful, Catherine added, understanding now why James was so excited about the concept. Give people real tools instead of just dreams. Exactly, James agreed, his eyes bright with vision. And Bobby here could be one of our first instructors. He knows cattle better than men twice his age. Bobby's face flushed with pride and embarrassment. I don't know nothing about teaching, Mr. Crawford. You know about working hard and learning from mistakes, James replied. Sometimes that's the most important thing to teach. As the evening wound down and their neighbors prepared to leave, Catherine felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. The ranch was secure, their future was bright, and they had found a way to turn their success into something that could help others. Thank you, she said to James as they stood together watching the last wagon disappear into the darkness. For what? For choosing us. For staying. For believing we could build something bigger than just survival. James pulled her close, his voice warm against her ear. Thank you for being worth choosing. For showing me that home isn't a place. It's the people who make you want to be better than you thought you could be. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the prairie, their voices carrying ancient songs of wildness and freedom. But Catherine no longer heard them as threats. She heard them as part of the music of home, part of the symphony of belonging that played every night on the Crawford Ranch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new dreams to pursue. But tonight, standing in the yard of the ranch she'd almost lost and saved, holding the hand of the man who'd chosen love over safety, Catherine Crawford felt rich in all the ways that truly mattered. The blizzard struck without warning on a Tuesday morning in January, turning the world white and deadly in less than an hour. Catherine pressed her face against the frost-covered kitchen window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched snow swirl like angry ghosts across the yard where she could no longer see the barn. "James!" she called, panic rising in her throat. "James, where are you?" But James had left at dawn to check the cattle in the far pasture, taking Bobby with him to repair a section of fence damaged by ice. They should have been back hours ago, and now the storm had turned so fierce that Catherine couldn't see 10 feet beyond the porch. Marcus appeared at her elbow, his young face tight with worry. "Mama, what if Papa James and Bobby are lost in the snow?" Catherine wrapped her arms around her son, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "They're smart men, Marcus. They'll find shelter and wait for the storm to pass." But even as she spoke the words, Catherine's mind raced with terrible possibilities. Men died in blizzards like this, frozen solid just yards from safety because they couldn't see where they were going. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees since morning, and the wind was strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet. A thunderous pounding on the door made them both jump. Catherine rushed to open it, hope flaring in her chest, but instead of James and Bobby, she found Pedro struggling against the wind with Maria and their 3 children huddled behind him. "Señora Catherine," Pedro shouted over the howling wind. "Our cabin roof. It collapsed under the snow. We have nowhere to go. Come in, come in." Catherine pulled them inside, snow swirling into the kitchen before she could slam the door shut. "Are any of you hurt?" "Little Anna twisted her ankle when the roof fell," Maria explained, supporting her youngest daughter who was trying not to cry. "But we are all alive, gracias a Dios." Catherine quickly set Maria and the children by the fire while Pedro helped her gather blankets and hot soup. But her mind kept returning to James and Bobby, somewhere out in that white hell with no shelter except what they could find or build. "Pedro," she said quietly, pulling him aside. "How long can a man survive in weather like this?" Pedro's weathered face was grim. "Depends on what clothes he has, if he can find windbreak, if he stays dry." "But, Señora," he shook his head. "This storm, it is very bad. Temperature dropping fast." Catherine felt her knees go weak. She'd survived David's death, Frank Olson's sabotage, and the threat of losing the ranch. But the thought of losing James to the merciless prairie winter made her physically sick. "We have to do something," she said desperately. "We can't just sit here and wait. In this storm, searching would be suicide," Pedro replied gently. "We would only get lost ourselves, maybe freeze to death trying to help them. Then what do we do?" Before Pedro could answer, a different sound cut through the wind, the sharp crack of breaking glass from somewhere in the house. Catherine grabbed the rifle and motioned for Pedro to stay with the families while she investigated. The sound had come from James's study, the small room where he'd been writing his veterinary guide. Catherine pushed open the door and gasped. The window had been shattered by the wind, and snow was already piling on his desk, covering the pages of his manuscript with deadly white. "His book?" Catherine whispered, rushing to gather the scattered papers. "All his work." As she collected the soggy pages, Catherine realized that saving James's writing had become more than just preserving paper and ink. The book represented everything he'd built here, everything he'd chosen over his old life. If he didn't survive the storm, this book would be his legacy, the gift he'd wanted to give to farmers and ranchers everywhere. Working quickly, she and Pedro managed to board up the broken window and move the manuscript to safety. But as they worked, Catherine's mind was formulating a desperate plan. "Pedro," she said slowly, "what if we could signal them somehow? Let them know where home is." "How?" "They cannot see anything in this storm." "Not see," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger with determination. "Here." She led him to the kitchen where the church bell James had bought her for Christmas sat on the mantelpiece. It was a beautiful brass bell, meant to call the family to dinner from the far reaches of the ranch. But it could serve another purpose now. "We ring the bell," Catherine explained. "Every few minutes, all night if we have to. Sound travels farther than sight in weather like this." Pedro's eyes lit with understanding. "See, like a lighthouse for the ears instead of the eyes." They bundled up and fought their way to the porch, where Pedro rigged a rope system that would let them ring the bell from inside the house. The wind tried to tear the sound away, but the deep bronze tone cut through the storm's roar like a knife. "Now we wait," Catherine said, settling in by the fire with Marcus on one side and little Anna on the other. "And we keep ringing that bell." The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every few minutes, Pedro would pull the rope and send the bell's call across the storm-lashed prairie. Between rings, they listened desperately for any sound that might indicate James and Bobby had heard them. By evening, the storm had only grown worse. The wind howled like a living thing, and snow piled against the windows until the house felt like a cave buried in white. Catherine tried to keep everyone's spirits up with stories and songs, but her own hope was beginning to fade. "Mama," Marcus whispered during a quiet moment, "what if they don't come back?" Catherine looked down at her son's frightened face and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "Then we keep this ranch running until they do. We honor everything they've built, and we never give up believing they'll find their way home." "But what if?" "No what-ifs," Catherine said firmly. "Your Papa James is the smartest, strongest man I know. If anyone can survive a storm like this, it's him." As if summoned by her words, a new sound penetrated the wind's howl, faint but unmistakable. The lowing of cattle moving closer to the house. "The herd!" Pedro jumped up, pressing his ear to the door. "They are bringing the cattle home." Catherine's heart leaped. James and Bobby must be driving the cattle back to the safety of the barnyard, using the animals' instinct to find shelter. But where were the men themselves? Pedro rang the bell furiously now, sending call after call into the storm. And finally, miraculously, they heard it. A human voice shouting through the wind, growing closer with each passing minute. Catherine threw open the door despite the driving snow and screamed into the storm. "James, we're here. Follow the bell." A shape materialized out of the white, a figure leading a horse with another person draped across the saddle. As they stumbled into the circle of light from the house, Catherine saw that it was Bobby, half frozen but walking, supporting James, who appeared to be unconscious. "Help me," Bobby gasped, his lips blue with cold. He fell through the ice on the creek. Been trying to keep him warm, but Catherine and Pedro rushed to help carry James into the house. His clothes were frozen solid, his face pale as death, and his breathing so shallow she could barely detect it. "Get his wet clothes off," Maria commanded, taking charge with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd raised children on the frontier. "We need warm blankets, hot water bottles, and soup if he can swallow it." As they worked to warm James back to life, Bobby told them what had happened. "Storm caught us checking the fence line. We tried to make it back, but couldn't see nothing. Then Mr. James spotted the cattle heading toward home and said we should follow them." "Smart thinking," Pedro said approvingly. "Was his idea to drive the herd instead of leaving them?" Bobby continued, his teeth chattering. "Said cattle know where safety is better than people do sometimes. But when we crossed the creek, the ice gave way under his horse. He went into the water up to his chest." Catherine felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she imagined James plunging into the icy creek, the shock of freezing water stealing his breath and strength. "How did you get him out?" "Roped him and pulled him to shore, but by then he was already getting confused from the cold. Kept trying to lie down in the snow, said he just needed to rest a minute." Bobby's voice cracked with emotion. "Had to tie him to his horse to keep him moving. For the next several hours, they fought to save James's life." Catherine held him against her body, sharing her warmth while Maria forced hot broth between his blue lips drop by drop. Pedro and Bobby took turns rubbing his frozen hands and feet, trying to restore circulation without causing further damage. "Talk to him," Maria advised. "Sometimes a familiar voice can call a person back from the edge." So Catherine talked. She told James about the cattle safely returned to the barn, about his manuscript rescued from the snow, about the farming school they were going to build together. She reminded him of all the reasons he had to live, all the dreams they still needed to fulfill. "You can't leave us now," she whispered against his ear. "Marcus needs his Papa James." I need my husband. The world needs your book, your knowledge, your stubborn determination to help people. As dawn broke over the storm-exhausted prairie, James's eyes finally fluttered open. His voice was just a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Catherine had ever heard. Did we save the cattle? Catherine laughed through her tears, relief flooding through her like warm sunshine. We saved the cattle. Bobby saved you, and you saved all of us by being smart enough to follow them home. James tried to sit up, winced, and settled back against the pillows. Bobby's a hero. Kept me alive when I wanted to give up. We're all heroes, Catherine said, looking around at the room full of people who'd survived the storm together. And we're all family. Outside, the wind was finally beginning to die down, and patches of blue sky showed through the breaking clouds. The blizzard was ending, but Catherine knew that what they'd built together, the bonds of love and loyalty forged in crisis, would last forever. Spring arrived like a miracle after the brutal winter, and Catherine stood in the doorway of their newly completed schoolhouse, watching the first class of students practice roping techniques under James's patient instruction. The building had risen from the prairie through the combined efforts of neighbors, students, and sheer determination, its fresh lumber gleaming golden in the April sunshine. Wider loop, Sarah. James called to the banker's daughter who'd enrolled despite her father's initial objections. Remember, you're not trying to catch the cow. You're giving her a chance to step into the rope. Catherine smiled as she watched Sarah Henderson, once the spoiled princess of Millbrook's only bank, struggle with a skill that Bobby Olson mastered with effortless grace. The farming school had attracted students from across Nebraska and beyond, young people hungry to learn practical skills that books alone couldn't teach. Mrs. Crawford? A soft voice behind her made Catherine turn to find Elizabeth Morrison, Tom Mitchell's niece from Iowa, holding a basket of freshly gathered eggs. The chickens laid 23 eggs this morning. Should I start preparing them for tomorrow's breakfast? That would be wonderful, Elizabeth. Thank you. Catherine marveled at how naturally the school had grown from James's original vision. What had started as a simple idea for teaching farming techniques had evolved into a complete community where students lived, worked, and learned together for months at a time. The sound of approaching wagons made Catherine shade her eyes against the sun. A small caravan was making its way down the dusty road toward the ranch, 3 wagons loaded with people and possessions, moving with the purposeful pace of those who traveled far to reach their destination. James, Catherine called. More students arriving. James finished demonstrating a proper lasso throw and walked over to join her, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. That should be the group from Illinois. 2 families looking to start fresh after losing their farms to debt. And the young man from Boston? David Chun, Dr. Chen's nephew, wants to learn ranch management so he can help his uncle expand into cattle breeding. Catherine watched the wagons approach with a mixture of excitement and concern. Each new group of students brought fresh energy and eager minds, but also new challenges. Housing, feeding, and teaching so many people required constant juggling of resources and schedules. Are we ready for this many people? She asked quietly. James followed her gaze to the approaching wagons, then looked back at the schoolhouse where Bobby was now teaching a group of younger students how to repair harness leather. A year ago, I would have said no, but look what we've accomplished already. He was right. The original farmhouse had been expanded with additional sleeping quarters. The barn had been rebuilt larger and stronger than before. They'd added a workshop for equipment repair, a dairy for milk production, and gardens that supplied fresh vegetables for the growing community. Besides, James added with a grin, we have the best foreman in Nebraska keeping everything running smoothly. Catherine looked over at Bobby, who'd transformed from Frank Olson's guilty son into a confident teacher and leader. The young man had found his calling in working with students, combining practical knowledge with the patience that came from understanding what it meant to make mistakes and learn from them. The first wagon reached the yard, and a weather-beaten man climbed down from the driver's seat with the careful movements of someone who'd been traveling for days. Behind him, a woman and 3 children peered out with the wide-eyed curiosity of people seeing their new home for the first time. Mr. Crawford? The man asked, approaching with his hat in his hands. I'm Robert Turner from Illinois. These are my wife Emma and our children. We wrote about enrolling in your farming program. Welcome to Crawford Ranch, James said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. We've been expecting you. How was the journey? Long but worthwhile, Emma Turner replied, climbing down from the wagon with a baby in her arms. We've heard wonderful things about what you're doing here. As the families settled in and began unloading their belongings, Catherine noticed a young man standing apart from the group. He was well dressed in city clothes, with soft hands and the pale complexion of someone who'd spent more time indoors than out. You must be David Chen, she said, approaching him with a welcoming smile. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for accepting my application. David's voice carried the educated accent of someone who'd grown up in Boston society. I have to admit, I'm a bit nervous about the practical aspects of ranch work. Everyone starts somewhere, Catherine assured him. Marcus was your age when he first learned to rope cattle, and now look at him. She pointed to where Marcus, now 13 and tall for his age, was helping the Turner children unload their possessions with easy competence. The shy 10-year-old who'd watched James arrive had grown into a confident young man who served as unofficial ambassador to new students. The secret, Catherine continued, is being willing to learn from your mistakes instead of being embarrassed by them. David nodded, though he still looked uncertain. Uncle Chun wrote that this place transforms people. I hope he's right. Transformation happens, Catherine said, thinking of her own journey from struggling widow to confident partner in a thriving enterprise. But only if you're willing to do the work. That evening, the entire community gathered in the main dining hall for their traditional welcome dinner. The room buzzed with conversation as established students shared stories with newcomers, and families compared experiences from their home states. James stood to address the group, his voice carrying easily across the room. We have a tradition here of asking each new student to share one thing they hope to learn and one thing they hope to contribute. Robert Turner, would you like to start? Robert stood, his weathered face serious but hopeful. We lost our farm in Illinois because I didn't understand soil management. Kept planting the same crops in the same fields until the land gave out. He paused, gathering courage. I hope to learn how to work with the land instead of just taking from it. And I hope to contribute. Well, I'm handy with machinery. Can fix most anything that's broken. Applause filled the room as Robert sat down, and Emma Turner rose to speak. I want to learn how to manage a household budget that actually works. Back home, I never knew if we'd have enough money for seed or supplies. Her voice grew stronger. I can contribute cooking and sewing skills, and I'm not afraid of hard work. One by one, each new arrival shared their hopes and offerings. David Chen wanted to learn ranch management and could contribute his education in bookkeeping and business planning. The Turner children, ranging from 8 to 16, wanted to learn everything and could contribute youthful energy and eager hands. When the introductions were finished, Bobby stood up with the confidence Catherine still marveled at. Mr. and Mrs. Crawford, I'd like to make an announcement. Catherine felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with concern. Bobby had been acting mysterious for the past few weeks, disappearing into town on errands he wouldn't discuss. I've been accepted to the State Agricultural College, Bobby said, his voice proud but uncertain. They want me to study advanced farming techniques and animal breeding. The room erupted in congratulations, but Catherine noticed the uncertainty in Bobby's expression. Bobby, that's wonderful news. You've earned this opportunity. But I don't want to leave here, Bobby said quickly. This place, this work, it's become my whole life. You folks are my family. James stood and placed a hand on Bobby's shoulder. Education isn't about leaving your family, Bobby. It's about making yourself more valuable to them. You'll learn things at college that you can bring back here to make our school even better. Really? You'd want me to come back? We're counting on it, Catherine said firmly. This place needs leaders who understand both practical work and scientific principles. You're going to be that kind of leader. Bobby's face lit up with relief and excitement. Then I'll go learn everything I can, and I'll come back ready to help build something even bigger and better. As the evening wound down and students began heading to their dormitories, Catherine found herself alone with James on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear prairie sky. "Remember when you first arrived?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. "I thought you were just a city man who'd answered my advertisement for practical reasons." "I was," James replied. "But somewhere between saving poisoned cattle and fighting barn fires, practical reasons became something much more important." "What did they become?" "Purpose," James said simply. "I spent years teaching theory to students who'd probably never use what I taught them. Here, we're teaching skills that will literally keep families fed and farms successful." Catherine looked out at the dormitory windows glowing with lamplight, knowing that behind each one were young people dreaming of the lives they were going to build with the knowledge they were gaining. "Do you think we're really making a difference?" "I know we are," James replied. "Every student who leaves here goes back to their community with new ideas and better methods. They teach their neighbors who teach their neighbors. Knowledge spreads like ripples in a pond. And we're the stone that starts the ripples? We're part of it. But the real power comes from people like Bobby and David and the Turner family, people brave enough to admit they need to learn new things and humble enough to do the work." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of cattle settling for the night and the soft murmur of conversation from the dormitories. "James," Catherine said finally, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't answered my advertisement? If you'd stayed in Boston and tried to rebuild your old life?" James considered the question seriously. "I think I would have spent the rest of my life feeling like something was missing. Success without meaning, knowledge without purpose, comfort without joy. And now I wake up every morning knowing that what we do here matters. That we're not just surviving or even prospering, we're building something that will outlast us." James pulled her closer. "We're creating a legacy that has nothing to do with money or prestige and everything to do with helping people build better lives." Catherine smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from work that aligned with her deepest values. "In that case, Professor Crawford, I'd say we're exactly where we're supposed to be." "Mrs. Crawford," James replied with mock formality. "I couldn't agree more." In the distance, a coyote called across the prairie, its voice carrying the wild music of the land they'd chosen to call home. But Catherine no longer heard it as a sound of loneliness or danger. She heard it as part of the symphony of belonging, part of the eternal song of people who'd found their place in the world and were determined to make it better.